Welcome back.
Welcome back. Yeah.
I have a welcome note for you, dear professors, researchers, students, and participants from Lund University and other universities. We are pleased and honored that Professor Noam Chomsky kindly accepted our invitation for having a webinar at Lund University and Department of Linguistics at Seoul. Professor Chomsky inspired us as a generation of linguists with his novel and insightful theories on language for decades. His dynamic and revolutionary theories and approaches change and challenge our vision to the world of language and linguistics and human knowledge. Professor Chomsky took us to the very nature of language and human mind. Professor Chomsky, we welcome you warmly to this webinar at Lund University. I wish to thank Dr. Arthur Holmer and Dr. Mikael Roll from Lund University who made possible this webinar to be held. They are co-hosts of this webinar. Professor Arthur, if you have something.
Yeah, okay. Well, I would also like to say on behalf of our department, welcome, Professor Chomsky. Most of us have been studying your books and reading your materials, and it's wonderful to actually see you here in almost real life. I believe I speak on behalf of everyone that it's a great honor to have you here as our guest on this webinar. I would just like to say a few items of housekeeping for everybody here participating, and that's that we are reaching the limits of the capacity of Zoom, which we have. There's still quite a few people coming in. So participants, if you could please keep your cameras and mics switched off. Not you, of course, Professor Chomsky, we want to hear and see you. But everyone else, if you have your mics and cameras switched off, then we won't risk overloading the system because we don't want the whole talk to be broken off by that. You're also aware that the session is being recorded. And the final point I would like to make is that Professor Chomsky will be basing his talk on questions which have been collected here. If there's any time at the end, then it will be possible to ask further questions, but to keep things simpler, we will be collecting questions, in that case, in the chat and not in spoken form. So with no further ado, thank you so much for coming, Professor Chomsky, and welcome. The floor is yours.
Yeah, should I start?
Yes, yes, please.
Okay, let me explain that I can barely hear, and we'd hoped to have a live transcription, but that didn't work. So what I'm going to have to do is shift between this and looking at another screen. I hope you'll still be, just as an experiment, if I switch, tell me if you can still see me.
You can still.
Yes, we can see you, dear.
No problem.
Yes.
Could you still see me when I,
Yes.
Yes,
when I
yes.
switch?
Yes.
Yeah, you could. Good. Okay, then I'll just read the questions and comment on them. First question is, how would you define language, mind, and thought, and how do you understand their interrelations? Well, let's suppose that you were to ask a physicist, how do you define energy, work, and spin, and understand their relations? What they could do is say, here are the technical definitions and for those words, and we understand their interrelations within an explanatory theory. But the physicist won't try to define the words energy, work, and spin in ordinary language. Terms are too indefinite, they're vague, there's no theoretical context for them. Well, it's basically no different in linguistics. The terms language, mind, and thought are used in all sorts of ways. As you perhaps know, in his famous paper in 1950, which introduced the field of artificial intelligence, Alan Turing paper on Can Machines Think? Turing began by saying that the question whether machines can think is too meaningless to deserve discussion because we have no clear concept of thought. And then he proposed a technical concept in terms of his imitation game, but it's the same throughout. So there is, there is, I've suggested a particular concept of language, technical concept, so I called it I language, I standing for internal to an individual, and intentional, that's with intentional with an S, meaning we're interested in the actual form of the coding of the system, not in some other systems that might have the same output. In other words, it's part of what's now called the biolinguistics program regarding language as a trait of the individual. That's I language, has a technical notion, technical definition. I think it's a well-defined, reasonably well-defined concept. You can study it clear by now, explanatory theories about it. And within those theories, there are interrelations between language and thought. Thought basically is what is generated by I language. I language is a system for generating thought. It's in line with a long tradition that goes back to classical Greece, classical India. I also defined another notion, or rather didn't define it, namely e-language. People use the concept e-language, but I don't know what they mean by it. By e-language, I just meant anything else. And I doubted that there is a coherent notion of language apart from I language. And I still think that that's essentially correct. Linguists often use the term e-language to mean the set of expressions generated by the I language, but that's a term that's derivative on I language. You can't talk about an infinite set without a finitary procedure for characterizing it. So to answer the question, there is a concept, I language, pretty clear, coherent, fits into a natural biological framework, a lot of work on it. There are theories about it. And you can talk about interrelations within those theories that includes a particular concept of thought, namely what is generated by I language. I don't know myself of any other, it's perfectly fine to study other topics. I'm not saying one has to keep to this, but I don't know of any clear characterization of those notions outside this framework. Well, the second question is, says Chomsky's 1959 review of B.F. Skinner's book, Verbal Behavior, is still often mentioned. If you were to read Verbal Behavior today, would your opinion about Skinner's attempt to account for language and behavior as terms be the same? Well, first of all, I can hardly imagine anyone reading it today. The topic has more or less disappeared. At the time, in the 1950s, Skinner's work was essentially orthodoxy in psychology of language, philosophy of language, W.V. Quine, the most influential Anglo-American philosopher of language, his definition of language was a complex language. Your language is a complex of verbal behavior established by Skinnerian conditioning. Actually, linguistics was not all that different. So Leonard Bloomfield, leading American linguist, and his characterization of language briefly is language is a matter of training and habit. If you read the more serious theoreticians, people like Charles Hockett, 1968, book State of the Art, basically the same concept. And by today, that's all completely gone. It was thought at the time, I thought, that conditioning, Skinnerian conditioning, other forms of conditioning, could yield results in deal with animal studies. That's very unclear now. Work in the 60s and since has raised the question whether conditioning even exists except as an artifact, something that shapes innate mechanisms in one or another way. So pigeons can be trained to play ping pong because pigeons peck, and you can moderately shape the pecking instinct so that it can take one or another form. Although, as studies have shown back to the 60s, the trained procedure tends to revert back to innate structures with as it persists. Altogether now, there's serious questions about whether there is a meaningful concept of learning. If you think about it, there's a spectrum that extends from what we call growth at one end and what we call learning at the other end. But it's a continuous spectrum. So take, say, an example of what's called growth. A human embryo becomes a human, not a duck, for example. Well, that doesn't happen independent of the environment. There has to be a nutritional input to the cell, to the embryo, for example, from the beginning, that triggers its growth to a human or a duck or something else. And that happens all through life. So it takes a learning, what we call learning how to walk. Well, obviously that's some complex interplay of innate structure, maturation, some slight modification by experience. People walk in different styles and different places, but you can't ask, is that growth or learning? Well, let's go to the opposite end, say learning the connection between the meaning of a word and its pronunciation. So in English, I say tree. In German, I would say Baum. That's what we call learning. Well, again, it's radically restricted by internal structure, both on the sound side and on the meaning side. There are certain possibilities that are available by virtue of their innate structure. Experience plays some role, tells you I should pronounce it tree, not Baum, but that's pretty superficial. That's the learning extreme. So is there even a coherent concept of learning? That's not at all clear by now. Going back to Skinner, I think the assumptions of that day with regard to conditioning, training, habit, none of them are viable. So the context basically doesn't exist at this point. Next question. Could there be a middle way between your rationalism and mentalism versus a constructivist approach to language learning, which claims that languages are constructed from input together with general cognitive, pragmatic, and processing constraints? Well, these are empirical questions, so everything's open. If somebody can suggest general mechanisms, cognitive, pragmatic, processing, they should be investigated. Well, what are they? Take some of the simplest properties of language. Say the fact that language is a system of discrete infinity, simplest possible property of language. Can anybody suggest a general learning mechanism that would yield that consequence? Well, so far nobody has, and in fact it's logically impossible. You either have the property of recursive enumeration, a discrete infinity, or you don't have it. You can't acquire it any more than you can acquire the understanding that the natural numbers go on forever. It's no use learning small numbers. It's just as hard to go from 0 to infinity as from 18 to infinity. It's the same problem. You either have the concept that the numbers go on forever or you don't. And it had to evolve in a single step. There's no steps that lead to it. Same is true of the property of discrete infinity of expressions, what's sometimes called the basic property of language. Each language yields a discrete infinity of hierarchically structured expressions, which have interpretations in other cognitive systems and can be, but need not be, externalized in some sensory motor system. It's the basic property of language. Nobody's ever suggested a general learning mechanism that could yield that property. The same is true when we turn to more specific properties of language. So perhaps the most fundamental principle of language is what's called structure dependence. Quite a surprising principle when you think about it. The fact that in the internal language, not the externalization sensory motor systems, but in the internal language, the language of thought, the operations pay no attention to linear order of words. That means that, this is already, experiment has shown that this is already known by about 2 years of age, as early as you can experiment with children. So if you take a standard example, if you take the sentence, the man who fixed the car carefully packed his tools, it's ambiguous. He could fix the car carefully, he could carefully pack his tools. If you put the adverb carefully in the front, carefully, the man who fixed the car packed his tools, it's unambiguous. Carefully seeks a verb phrase, but it doesn't pick the closest one. Fix the car, picks more remote one, packed his tools. Well, that's structure dependence. If you look at the structures, it's picking the structurally closest and ignoring the structurally more remote. But what that means is that from infancy on, and this is true of every construction in every language, As far as everybody knows, it's uniform. Not for externalization. There you use linear properties, but for the internal language. Well, plainly unlearnable, no evidence for it. It means that the child is, from infancy, is ignoring 100% of what it hears, words in linear order, and is attending to only what its mind creates, abstract structures. Well, is there a general cognitive pragmatic processing mechanism that can yield that result? It's not even worth trying. I should say that in the literature, the cognitive science, machine learning literature, there are many articles attempting to show that you could find this investigation of statistical, huge corpora, statistical analysis of huge corpora. Them fail, but it doesn't really matter because they're answering the wrong, they're looking at the wrong question. The question is, why don't children use what's immediately available to them? Sequences of words in linear order, simple algorithms. Why don't they use those? That's the question. So all these efforts are a waste of time. They're looking at the wrong question. And we're back to the fact that there are no general mechanisms that can yield this. Well, let's turn to another area, learning of words. How do you learn the meaning of the word cat or dog or run or chase or anything? By now there's extensive experimental work on this. The most extensive detailed work is by the late psycholinguist Lila Gleitman. And what she's demonstrated is that children acquire words in their full richness of meaning, which is quite complex, on very few presentations. By now, there's been careful statistical analysis of the data available to children by age 3 or 4. Turns out it's very sparse. There's a lot of words, but not many bigrams, very few trigrams. The reason is basically Zipf's law, means that certain short words get repeated over and over, other words very rarely. So putting all this together, it's turning out that children are learning the rich meanings of words with very few presentations. Is there a general mechanism for that? Nothing imaginable, certainly nothing that's been proposed. We can go on. So the answer to the question, I think, isn't there's a middle way. I mean, it's of course true that input is part of acquisition of language. If I had never heard English spoken, I wouldn't be speaking English. So input is certainly there. There may be some general principles involved, cognitive principles, memory, and so on, but you just have to work it out. The basic story seems to be that it's just internal processes which are triggered by external experience, but then proceed on their own, depending on their own internal nature, and much like other instinctive behavior, the vision, walking, everything seems to work pretty much like this. There's no particular reason to expect language to be very different. I think the more we learn about it, the more this kind of picture becomes, falls into place. There's no room for dogmatism. It's an empirical question. Somebody comes up with new ideas about language learning, constructivist approaches, fine, let's have a look at them. Do you believe that the brain has a language model and that it functions like a Turing machine. Well, a Turing machine just means a well-defined computational procedure that enumerates a discrete infinity of entities. I can't think of a coherent alternative to that. That's the most elementary property of language, what I call the basic property, which means it's Turing computable. Does the brain have a language module? Well, it's at least got to have this property. Is that property dissociated from other systems? For example, is it the same as the systems that we see used in, say, vision, touch, locomotion, and so on? Seems quite different in its properties. Doesn't seem to have close analogs in other systems of the mind-brain. If that's the case, then it's a language module by definition. Doesn't mean that it's separate from the rest of the brain. You can't cut it out. The neurons, cells that are involved in these functions also are involved in other ones. But at an abstract level, when you're talking about the subsystems that enter into the total complex of human thought and action, it seems to have quite separate properties as far as is known today. Let me go on to the next one. Are the basic principles of UG, binarity, recursion, left-right asymmetry, genetically hardwired in the human brain? Or could they be the result of optimization of any complex communicative system to achieve maximal effect with minimal cognitive effort? In other words, could we assume that the communication system of an intelligent alien species would follow more or less the same kinds of principles as human language? Well, there's a lot to unpack in that question. It brings up many issues. Let's start step by step. It talks about any complex communicative system. That presupposes that language is a communication system. Well, what does that mean exactly? Language is, of course, used for communication. Hands are used for typing. Does that mean that hands are a typing system? The fact that language is used for communication doesn't mean used, but it's quite unclear what it's supposed to mean. The usual idea in the background is that somehow a primary function of language is communication. Maybe language evolved from animal communication systems. If that's what's meant by it, it just seems to be wrong. It's a modern dogma. It was not believed in the past. There's several millennia of tradition which regard language as fundamentally a thought system. The 20th century structuralist, behaviorist, whatever you want to call it, change, let's say, regression in my opinion, but whatever you call it, it did introduce the dogma that language is a system of communication, basically like other communication systems. That apparently is false. It seems that where there are conflicts between communicative efficiency and computational efficiency, communicative efficiency is always sacrificed. There are many aspects of language design which are quite dysfunctional for communication. Nothing at all surprising about that from an evolutionary point of view. Evolution, when it proceeds, does not take into account what will be functional. You think about evolution, think about evolution in a general way. It has, you can abstract it to three different stages. First, some disruption takes place in the system, maybe a mutation, maybe gene transfer, maybe symbiosis. Millions of years ago, a bacterium accidentally swallowed another microorganism, led to the development of complex eukaryotic cells. There are accidents like that all the time. So the first stage in evolution is some kind of disruption of the system. Second stage is that nature tries to find a way of dealing with the new system. There's every reason to believe that nature looks for the simplest way to deal with the new system. That's the way nature works generally, physics, biology, other areas. So that's the second stage. Then comes the third stage, a winnowing stage. Now, those organisms that have greater reproductive success tend to dominate. It's natural selection. Notice that in the second stage, reconstructing the system, nature pays no attention to what the functions will be. It has no way of doing so, just finds the best system. Then you get successful organisms proliferate. Okay, well, take language. Every reason to believe it worked the same way. Some disruption took place, which yielded Turing computability, recursive enumeration of that yields something like the basic property. It's the first stage. Second stage, nature tried to find the simplest way of handling this thing. In contemporary work, that's called the strong minimalist thesis. It's the thesis that maybe language is like everything else in the world, and in the stage of reconstruction, nature looked for the simplest system. Apparently for language, it never reached the third stage. As far as we know, the natural selection stage, as far as we know, all humans have the same language faculty. There's no evidence that any tribe of humans, no matter how long it's been separated from other humans, has any different language capacity. Doesn't seem to be any adaptation to particular languages. If that's the case, then the third winnowing stage was never reached, which is not too surprising. The humans are a very young species, maybe a couple 100,000 years, which is an eye blink in evolutionary time. There's no evidence that anything like language existed before Homo sapiens. So it's possible that there just wasn't enough time for selection to have any effect. But the end result is a system which, as far as we know, is very well designed for thought. In fact, it yields thought, but it seems to be, of course, usable for communication. We use it just as we use hands for typing, but that seems not to be any kind of essential property of language. And and it seems to have no relation, no analogs to communication systems in animals. There's plenty of experimental evidence for this. So there have been major efforts, serious, sophisticated efforts to raise chimps, our closest relatives, the way children are raised. The NIM project is the major one. Nothing. It's impossible. You can't get anything. Otherwise intelligent chimp just gets absolutely nowhere with language, just doesn't have that faculty. Well, it seems very clear that there is a language faculty. It developed in the second stage stage of evolution. Therefore, there is universal grammar, which is just the theory of that faculty. Then comes the empirical inquiry into what it is. Well, and how does it, notice that it will be the universal grammar, the language faculty, the shared language faculty, will be one factor in the acquisition of an individual language. There's got to be other factors. One factor is in experience, data. Can't acquire a language without data. And then the third factor is what we would expect to find elsewhere in nature, general principles that are not specific to language. Since it's a computational system, it's quite natural to look for universal computational principles, principles of economy, others which just hold for computational systems altogether. Here we move on to a speculation which has been very well established in the natural sciences. Goes back to Galileo, who initiated the modern scientific revolution with the thesis that nature is simple and it's the task of the scientist to show it. That should be true of everything from the motions of the tides to planetary motions to the flight of birds and so on. Well, that's been a guiding principle of science for hundreds of years. It's formulated sometimes as Leibniz's law of least effort. It's a speculation, but it's been demonstrated so overwhelmingly that by now it's just taken as a doctrine. Einstein called it the miracle creed. It seems that the more you learn about things, the more they reach this conclusion. Well, maybe language is the same. In that case, you would have this, what's called the strong minimalist thesis. But it's, as for what, it's all, something's got to be wired in the brain, UG at least, with whatever its properties are. Well, what about when we turn to an intelligent alien? If it has at least Turing computability, if it doesn't, it's not going to have anything like language. But if it has at least Turing computability, you could expect it to have some of the optimal properties that language apparently has. So we're trying to show there's actually some work on this, which could go into if you like, but as a general principle, that's linguistics, which seeks to investigate questions, has some interesting results. Well, next question. Looking back at the history of research and different approaches we've had in trying to answer our questions, is there a tradition in linguistics that we should pay more attention to? Well, that's for you to decide what you think relates to your interests, to concerns, where there are results that you find engaging, stimulating, you want to pursue, and so on. I can only answer for myself. For me, at least, the tradition that seems to me the productive one, the one that has led to deep insights, is likely to in the future, is a very rich tradition that goes back to classical Greece, classical India, Aristotle, in the Indian tradition, Bhartrhari, one of the founders of the rich generative tradition in Indian grammar and philosophy. For them, language was the system of thought, generated thought. Thought is what's generated by language. go through the centuries, get to the early modern scientific revolution, Galileo and his contemporaries, among them the linguists, logicians of the Port Royal monastery. They expressed their awe and amazement at what they regarded as an astonishing, miraculous property that with a few symbols, each of us can produce infinitely many expressions constituting thoughts, and even more can convey to others who have no access to our minds, the inner workings of our minds. They regarded this as an astonishing phenomenon, correctly, I think. Sometimes called it the Galilean challenge. Galileo himself regarded the alphabet as the most spectacular of human inventions because it could record this miracle. This was later repeated by Gottlob Frege, undoubtedly without awareness, in pretty much the same words. Out of this grew the tradition of what was called general rational grammar. General because it was supposed to be universal, rational because it sought explanations, not just descriptions. That lasted through the 19th century, early 20th century. Perhaps the last major representative of it was Otto Jespersen. Then it pretty much disappeared, was swept aside by behaviorist, structuralist currents. It's been revived in the generative enterprise, more specifically in what's now called the minimalist program. But I'm just speaking for myself. For me, that's the tradition that I think we should pay attention to, but you decide for yourselves on the basis of your interests and concerns. Now, the next set of questions is about the language system. First one is, what's the role of the lexicon within the language system? Does it play an active or passive role? Well, here there's a distinction which is often overlooked, but is crucial. The distinction between generation and production, between what Aristotle called possession of knowledge and use of knowledge. Generation is possession of knowledge. It's neither active nor passive. Generative grammar doesn't do anything. There's no actions. A generative grammar simply says, here's the infinite array of well-formed expressions, well-formed derivations. It's like a formalized axiom system, say for arithmetic. The formalized system doesn't do anything. It says, here's an infinite array of geometrical objects, which are the well-formed proofs. That's it. That's Turing computability. That's generation. That distinction was not made in the tradition because the notion of computability was not understood. It was really not until the mid-20th century that there was a clear understanding of that. But now we can make the distinction sharply. Generation is possession of knowledge, not active or passive. Production is an action. Now, when you talk about the lexicon, in the generative system, there's no active or passive roles. It just functions the way it does within the generative system. In production or perception, which are actions, there is an active role. And you can ask interesting questions about what role does the language play there. In fact, one interesting, very lively research question today is whether the lexicon is stored. So is there a storage of words in your mind, and you access that store when you speak and when you hear, or An alternative view is what's stored, the rules for generation of the words. Alec Morantz has done a lot of neurological and linguistic work, he and his team, on this, which have pretty good evidence that what's stored is not the words, but the generative rules that form them. So possible words, even if not in a lexicon, function the same way as words that happen to be in the lexicon with regard to neural activity and so on. So that's a live research question. What's stored and what's generated? And that'll be, is the question of what's the role of lexicon within production and perception. Within the language system, it's whatever the best theory of the language is. Is labeling projection, Chomsky 2013, necessary for a minimal syntax? The syntactic objects seem to contain all the elements and structure needed for semantic interpretation. It's easy to see how external-internal merge and agree are essential to building up structures with a semantic and pragmatic interpretation. Labeling stands out as less critical. Could it be that the structures that cannot be labeled are not really syntactically, but rather semantically constrained? Actually, there are some of the linguists doing the most exciting work, like Norbert Hornstein, regard labeling as the core property. I don't happen to agree with that, but it's a perfectly reasonable, sensible proposal. Every approach that I know of has some kind of labeling. So we have to distinguish a verb phrase from a noun phrase, for example. That means labeling. They behave differently in the syntax, in the phonology, in the semantics, so we got to distinguish them. Well, labeling has usually been assumed to be kind of trivial. It's been assumed for a long time. In fact, the paper of mine that's cited is the one break from this tradition. It's been assumed that structures are endocentric. Just doesn't happen to be true. Plenty of exocentric structures. For endocentric structures, there is a simple procedure of labeling. You take the head and call that the label. What's called projecting the head. But that's a labeling convention. And it gives you the distinction in verb phrase and noun phrase and many others. When you go to exocentric constructions, it's quite different. And that 2013 paper that you mentioned and some papers that follow it up and develop it further are efforts to deal with this more general problem. I don't see any way to avoid it. I don't see how semantic or pragmatic constraints enter. Of course, they impose conditions that have to be met, like the semantics, just as phonetics does, but that's different from the workings of the system. Well, the next to last question is about how clause external elements can affect clause internal grammatical processes. Then come a couple of examples from Icelandic and Italian. So translating to English, something that would mean the book is interesting, I'm buying it, I will buy it. The idea behind the question is that the pronoun it refers to the book from an earlier sentence. But notice that that's not accurate. Let's take a slightly different scenario. Suppose I'm in a store. I want to buy a new computer. Salesman comes up, we talk for a while. He shows me a book he's reading. I say the book looks interesting. Then I say, I'll buy it, referring to the computer. Nothing wrong with that. It's perfect. The fact is that there's nothing in the language that determines what the pronoun refers to. There are circumstances in which we'll take it to refer to the book. There are other circumstances in which we'll take it to refer to something else that's under consideration. So it's just not the case that clause external elements can affect clause internal grammatical processes. It is the case that circumstances affect how we're going to interpret things, but that's not surprising. How could it be otherwise? These examples from pronouns are quite misleading. Well, pretty much the same is true for the last question. The accusative cases of the pronouns, hana, lo, is computed clause internally, but their gender comes from clause external antecedents, like a male speaking or a female speaking. So clause internal syntax cooperates with clause external factors. Here, the pragmatically conceived gender of the speaker affects predicate agreement in the infinitive. What's my take on this? Well, again, this is a matter of production, not generation. In the use of language, innumerable factors enter. We know that. We don't have to debate it. It's not questionable. The internal nature of language, language is only one of the factors that enter into discourse and use of language. Use of language is a much more complex affair. So I don't think there's any issue there to be concerned about. Well, as far as I can see, that ends the questions that were submitted. And seeing you again, I think Zoom has run out.
Yeah, there's
Here
no
we
question
are.
here. There is the opportunity of for people, if you have any further questions or comments on the questions, to send, please send them in that case in the chat. I don't, would you be able to see the chat, Professor Chomsky, if it's,
I think,
if something comes in?
are they?
Dear Professor, could you possibly see the chat room? There are some questions.
There aren't any yet, but there might come
Okay.
some. But
Or do we have questions in the room that
we have questions in the room, yeah.
And possible questions. Good. Live in chat room.
Here's
What
one.
do I think about the implications of epigenetics on the evolution of language? It's possible. I mean, evolution of epigenetics it's a real phenomenon. It's not an invention. It's pretty rare. It's pretty hard to find cases. In the case of evolution of language, I think it's quite unlikely that we'll find anything. And the reason is because of the very brief period in which language has evolved. Again, let's just take a look at the facts aren't certain by any means. There's a lot unknown about all these things. But what we know, as far as we know today, there's genomic evidence that humans began to separate roughly on the order of 150,000 years ago. That's not very long after humans appeared. Humans appeared about 200 to 300,000 years ago. Very shortly after the separation of humans, we find rich, complex symbolic behavior. Before Homo sapiens appeared, we find almost nothing. Marks on a bone or something like that. Well, a lot is on. Incidentally, these are very brief periods in evolutionary time, very brief eye blinks. So what it makes it look like is that language emerged pretty much along with humans, hasn't changed since. So the role of, it's very unlikely that epigenetics will show us anything. What do I think of vegan food? I think it's fine if you want to be vegan. It's also fine to turn down your thermostat and not heat your house, or to walk instead of driving. We have a real serious crisis, very serious crisis of heating of the environment, and a very short period in which we can deal with it. All of these things like vegan food, wearing a sweater, walking instead of driving, all of these things contribute to it. The main thing, they're all minor. They're worth doing, but they're not the real problem. The real problem is ending the use of fossil fuels. Unless we do that, we're finished, okay? There's a brief period in which we can do it, not long, and unfortunately we're going in the opposite direction. Fossil fuel use is increasing. The fossil fuel companies are exuberant, huge profits, new fields being opened up for exploitation. Some of what's happening is, if you were watching this from another planet, you'd think the whole species is totally insane. So take just last week. Last week, there were a couple of important scientific reports that came out about the Middle East region and Eastern Mediterranean. They found that it's heating about far more rapidly than had been assumed, about twice as fast as had been assumed. And by the end of the century, it will be about 5 degrees Celsius hotter. That's approaching the limits of survivability. Another study found, this is by Israeli scientists, that their estimates of sea level rise were much too low, and that in fact, by 2050, Mediterranean sea levels will have risen about 1 meter. By end of the century, 2.5 meters. Just think for a minute what that means. Total disaster, catastrophe. Well, why this is going on, Israel and Lebanon are squabbling about who will have the right to administer the coup de grace, who will have the right to produce the fossil fuels on their maritime border. You can't imagine greater insanity. And this is happening in South Asia, it's happening in the United States, it's happening in Europe, everywhere. It's as if we're sleepwalking to disaster. So talk about vegan food, wearing sweaters, all of that is fine, but it's very marginal. Well, I see other questions have come in. Let me see if I can go back to them. The relation of our human language to animal language is very interesting, I think. Dogs can learn words, some several hundreds. Cats make sounds, different sounds for different wishes. Is this similar to our language? How does it differ? I've got a couple of dogs. I study them carefully. They understand things I said. No animal can learn any word. We think they're doing it, but as soon as we begin to study it, they're not doing it. The careful investigations have shown that. The most careful of all is the NIM project. Very fine researchers, some of them friends, former students, Tom Bever, Laura Tito, headed by Herb Terrace, leading Skinnerian psychologist. They tried very hard in every possible way to raise a chimp from infancy the way a human would be. For a couple of years, they confused themselves into believing that the chimp was actually learning something when they reviewed the videotapes, studied them. Turned out that it was a clever Hans affair. They had convinced themselves, but the chimp was learning nothing. It was just learning, if I do this gesture, sometimes I'll get a banana. And so I'll do this gesture a couple times, but it could never get even the minimal concept of a word. And the same is true for every other animal. They simply just don't have the concepts, either the concept of recursive generation or the concept, whatever it is, that allows a human infant to learn the meaning of a word with very few presentations. And nobody understands why, but this just seemed to be distinctive human features. The rest is sentimentality. It's nice to believe that my dog understands what I'm saying, but if I look at it carefully, it's picking up signals and doing whatever it's doing in its own mind. Jerry Fodor has claimed roughly that Darwinian evolution inherits the same problems about learnability as Skinnerian learning does. Therefore, what logically cannot be learned also cannot logically evolve. Jerry was an old friend, close friend, I think very highly of him, but this argument just doesn't work. I mean, he was arguing against a position which is not held by evolutionary biologists. He was arguing informally, in informal discourse. Evolutionary biologists talk about evolution as being for something, like a polar bear's white skin, white hair is for survivability. That's loose talk. That's not what evolutionary biologists are doing. Evolution is not for anything. It just happens. It happens in the ways, and in fact, if you read the first chapter of that joint book, the book is a joint book with Massimo Piattelli, who's a very good biologist and computer scientist. And in Massimo's chapter, he goes through dozens of ways in which disruption takes place in a system and sets the stage for the next thing that's going to happen. But Jerry Fodor's argument is basically irrelevant to evolutionary theory. So I don't think it shows anything. What it shows is that informal talk is misleading, very misleading. The idea that evolution is for something, say that language evolved for communication, that's all meaningless. Evolution isn't for anything. It just happens. Things that are where organisms can adapt, they do. Plenty of the things that evolution has created are totally dysfunctional. Every one of us knows that almost everybody has back pains. The reason you have back pains is the spine is just very badly designed. Any engineer could do something better. But it was step by step as it evolved, it was the best, simplest solution to that problem. Look at it over time, it's a rotten solution. It's just these are misunderstandings about the way evolution works. I agree with it. Artificial neural networks are not plausible models of competence acquisition based on linear order, huge amounts of training, supervised, as compared to children who very early on show they prefer hierarchical structure, need very little data, and are supervised learners. However, when children listen to speech, they do predict upcoming linguistic material, as do adults. And when the question of what constitutes competence has been resolved, some eons in the future, there's going to be a question of how we predict incoming linguistic material and language use. Could ANNs come in handy here, since they're good at making predictions? Well, first, The ANNs, it's true, have all of the properties that you mentioned that are different from humans, but there's a much more significant one, which is rarely discussed. The ANNs are too powerful. Too powerful. If you're doing science, not engineering, you want answers to questions why things are this way and not some other way. The second part is crucial. So if I were to go into a physics conference and say, I got a terrific theory, it includes all the laws of nature, the ones you found and the ones you haven't found yet. And it's so simple, I can say it in 2 words. Anything goes, okay? That's going to include all the laws of nature, those that have been found, those that haven't been found. I don't get the Nobel Prize for that because it doesn't say why things don't happen. Now you take a look at all the ANNs, the GMT series and Lambda, all of them work just as well or better on impossible languages. They're like my speech to the physics conference. They're saying nothing about language, nothing. They're using up a lot of California's energy, but to no purpose that I can see. The deep learning can do things like the live transcription that I was unable to use today is a brute force achievement of deep learning. And I'm very happy to have it. It's very useful for me. It's even contributed to science in some ways, like the massive data processing available with supercomputers and deep learning has made a significant contribution to the problem of protein folding. That's real. But what these language models are like, I have no idea. They're not doing anything useful. They're telling us nothing about language. As for, it's true that children, adults can make guesses about what's coming next. And these systems also make guesses about what's coming next. Are they telling us how it's done? I doubt it very much for the reasons you mentioned. If you put a battery of supercomputers on 50 terabytes of data, you're going to get all kinds of recognition of patterns. But humans are nothing like that. As I mentioned, when you look carefully at the data, it turns out to be pretty sparse, but yet we're making the predictions. So we're doing it some other way, whatever that other way is. So it's an open question, but I doubt very much that these methods are going to contribute to it. They're good at what they're good for. They're good for brute force engineering, live transcription, Google Translate. Those things are all fine. Bulldozers are fine, much better than shoveling the snow by hand. I have nothing against them, but they're not a contribution to science. And until these systems fail on impossible languages, they won't be telling us anything. What do you think of the fascination that speakers of many languages seem to have by pairing alliterating words syntactically, fast and furious, plug and play? Yeah, I did the same. I don't know why. It's infants do it, children do it. They love word games like that. As far as I know, there's no understanding of it. Maybe it's not language, but do animals communicate among themselves? If we believe they do, what do you think about the perspective of humans understanding the animals' language communications? Well, animals certainly communicate. Trees communicate. We don't know of any organisms that don't communicate. Actually, trees do communicate through their roots. So if there's a fungus on one tree, the information goes through the roots and gets to other trees, and they do something to protect themselves from the fungus. Well, can we get to understand it? Yes, we do. For example, we've learned something about communication of trees, learned something about communication of birds, what known about bird song and what it does. You can understand the communicate. I don't know how much communication there is among dogs. They sort of bark at each other, but maybe something's going on. But there's no reason why you can't understand it. So I think it's a fine study. It's a very rich study of animal communication. We just shouldn't confuse it with human language, which, as I said, is only incidentally used for communication. You tend to keep linguistic theory and political activism separate, assuming that social and political issues are not scientific. What do you think about naturalizing political thinking as Lakoff does when speaking of the political mind? Yes, he speaks of the political mind. As far as I know, you want to talk about the political mind? Okay, I don't think it contributes anything to social and political activism and a lot of my life on. I tend to keep linguistic theory separate from it because it is separate. So if it's separate, it's not separate. I mean, if some friend of mine who's an evolutionary biologist is an anti-nuclear protest, he doesn't claim that the evolutionary biology has anything to do with anti-nuclear protest. Why? I mean, they're totally separate domains. You want to talk about them? Maybe you can convince the Democratic Party to hire you. I don't know, but I don't see. If you find something there, fine. I can't find anything. What do you think about the argument that humans actually can't generate an infinite number of utterances simply because of the limited capacity of the human mind? Well, that's a misunderstanding of Turing computability. So take your laptop. Your laptop has finite memory. Your laptop has a calculator in it, which can add numbers, but it can only add up to a finite bound. However, if you stick more memory into your laptop without changing its structure, that's the crucial point. Changing nothing in the laptop, just adding more memory, then it'll go on calculating. That's Turing computability. Same with humans. Doesn't matter. This is incidentally a mistake that goes back to Charles Hockett in his 1968 book, State of the Art. It's just a misunderstanding of what Turing computability is. So you can take embedding. Embedding's pretty well studied. George Miller and I, 60 years ago, studied embedding. Turns out that humans, you can understand a sentence with embeddings up to about 6 or 7 embeddings. Takes a little work, but you can understand, if you listen, you can understand it. Well, that's the limits of short-term memory. So yes, says we have the same short-term memory as other animals. However, if you given paper and pencil and you can calculate it, you can go on forever. You can understand embedding of depth 80 if you have the patience, which means that whatever's coded inside is a recursive procedure which is independent of memory. That's Turing computability. So all the questions we have space for. Okay, thank you.
Professor Chomsky, you're muted. Can you unmute? Unmute, yeah.
Thank you so much, Professor Chomsky, for this wonderful seminar. And we hope to see you again here at Lund University. And thank you for replies and for everything.
Yeah. I would also like to say thank you to Mehdi Sabzevari for actually taking the initiative of arranging this seminar. So it's been really great having you here, and we hope that we can have this redo this at some point in the future. It's been really inspiring, and thank you very much for taking the time to give us this webinar. Ja, ska det vara.